Good afternoon and welcome to Compliance Week's webcast forum on conflict minerals. I'm Joe Mont of Compliance Week and I'll be hosting this webcast. Today we're going to be talking about the best practices for meeting the current and evolving regulatory requirements of conflict minerals compliance. Before we hear from our guest, let me quickly go over the agenda for this afternoon. We're scheduled to go for 1 hour today. I'm going to give a very brief introduction, and then we'll jump right into the presentation sponsored by IPoint. That presentation will be followed by a question and answer session. Your questions will be kept confidential and anonymous, so please don't be shy. You can ask your questions at any time using the Ask a Question function on the left-hand side of your screen, and I'll pose them to our guests at the end of their presentation. After the Q&A, I'll be back to wrap up the webcast. This webcast will also offer CPE credit for all attendees. To obtain your CPE credit, wait until the webcast is completely over and I sign off. At that point, the final examination will be presented automatically in a separate window. If you have trouble viewing the CPE test or receiving the CPE certificate, please send an email to info@complianceweek.com to request a copy. I'll repeat these instructions at the end of the webcast, so if you missed anything, just stay tuned. Just a couple other administrative details. At any time during the presentation, listeners can download the slides from the drop-down menu on the left-hand side of your screen. You can also hit the View Slide Full Screen button at the bottom of your screen if you wish to increase the size of that slide. And lastly, a Help button is there in the upper right-hand corner of your screen should you need assistance. Today's webcast is part of a webcast forum Compliance Week holds 4 times per year. Our guests have been Chief Compliance and Governance Officers at leading public companies and experts on various compliance, regulatory, governance, and risk topics. Rather than read the upcoming schedule, I direct you to visit www.complianceweek.com for details or to register. And also, don't forget to register for Compliance Week's annual conference, May 19th through 21st in Washington, D.C. Details on the event and speakers are also on our website. So, let's get on to our program. Please welcome Dan Hertzberg, Technical Sales Manager, North America for IPoint. Dan has worked in the enterprise software industry since 2000 and has spent the past 8 years helping leading corporations solve material compliance and sustainability challenges more efficiently with software solutions. We're glad to have you all here today, and Dan, it's now over to you.
Okay, good afternoon. Today I'm going to talk about conflict minerals and how companies can take advantage of some of the best practices and database tools to support the upcoming requirements. I'm also going to touch on some evolving regulatory environment and how companies can better prepare for long-term success. All right, a little introduction on IPoint first. We're a leading compliance and sustainability solutions provider. We help companies assure compliance by delivering automation that enables them to efficiently connect with their supply chains throughout the product lifecycle. We've been providing solutions to help companies meet the SEC requirements for conflict minerals reporting. We have to date over 13,000 subscribers on our web-based solution that, like our other solutions, automates the supplier data acquisition process, analyzes and stores the data centrally, exposing supply chain risk and making reporting much more accurate and quick. So all of you will recognize most, if not all, of these products because they represent end products in and of themselves, or some are components of products that you use every day. And all of them have one thing in common, which is they each require certain critical raw materials to function. Without these critical materials, the products simply won't work. Now, this might be a small problem for some products, and we could probably do without them for others, but for still other products, this is a big problem, particularly those that are critical to defense, transportation, communication, or are contained in a life-saving medical device. Not having them work is simply unacceptable. So, for better or worse, many of these minerals are concentrated in certain countries which might have unstable governments, and directly or through our supply chains, we run the risk of doing business in places where human rights aren't respected, and we might be doing business with people who could potentially abuse workers who mine and process these materials, and perhaps where revenue generated from these operations might fund illegal and violent activities. It's a scary reality, and while we need these minerals, it's really the role of companies through corporate social responsibility efforts to make sure that we conduct business legally and ethically, and that we vet our supply chains carefully to assure that we're not inadvertently supporting the atrocities committed in these countries. So this has garnered such attention that it's now not just voluntary, but it's mandated by law. DoddFrank 1502, which was passed in its current form in August of 2012, is law. And as we all know, this law requires publicly held companies to report on the sources of conflict minerals, DRC, and the surrounding region. Now, the reporting period began in January of 2013, and the initial reports to the SEC are due on May 31st of this year, which is 100 days from today. And the way to track those sources is by vetting our supply chains, and it's going all the way upstream to the material smelter. So what's required and who's impacted by this? The law mandates public companies to declare the use of 3TG originating in the DRC and surrounding regions. Who's impacted? Almost everyone. So for public companies that manufacture products that contain 3TG or one of its many derivatives, it's pretty clear that there's a reporting requirement. But the data they need comes from you and your supplier and so on. And for customers, and your customers in particular, even though those that may not be public, they may impose reporting requirements on your company, and your company may have an active conflict minerals program and need this data as well, particularly if you've got a recognized brand where consumers have a preference for sustainable products or where you have the attention of NGOs. So the question really of how we do this is answered by the guidelines of the OECD, which is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Essentially, there's some basic steps, and I won't go through all of them in detail, but effectively, you need to get executive support, create a project charter, you need to build a cross-functional team, and get your arms around your direct materials suppliers. Then you need to use the resources of your cross-functional team and your available databases to identify suppliers with 3TG or potential for providing 3TG. You need to survey them using standard reporting tools. Chances are they filled that out for other customers, which is a good reason to use standards, and it makes it easier for them to respond. And as the suppliers respond, you need to identify the red flags. You know, who are the unknown smelters? Do they have bad sourcing policies? Are there unknown sources? Perhaps they're not declaring materials that they clearly provide, whatever those red flags are. Then you need to plan and document corrective actions that are related to the supply chain, towards achieving a conflict-free supply chain, and manage that information such that it's auditable and reportable. So what are the challenges? And even if you've seen the OECD guidelines, the challenges of actually carrying this out are substantial because you need to request information, and that has to flow through multiple layers of the supply chain. Now, the very thought of that makes some people cringe, and depending on your product and your company, whether you have a global supply chain, it's complex, it can be huge, especially for companies that may have thousands of suppliers. And based on my own experience with my customers, it's a pretty formidable task for some companies, even with less than 100 suppliers, when the process is purely manual, without any database or any tools whatsoever to assist. So with a manual process, it's pretty challenging to know, for example, who you sent requests to, who's received the requests. The responses are hard to find to determine who's, given you answers or who hasn't, and whether those data are actually accurate and meaningful. And what happens when you have multiple business units, multiple facilities across multiple geographies, and perhaps multiple suppliers for the same account, same components, etc.? So without having accurate and meaningful data, you're just not going to be able to provide a report, one that your customer's asking for and depending on, and one that if it may be required by law if you are in fact, a public company that needs to report directly to the SEC. So software tools are required, and the required capabilities come right out of the OECD guidelines. So I'm not going to read this table, but minimum essential elements are, in a nutshell, a database solution. In fact, one that leverages standard reporting formats, such as EICC, GESI, and eventually IPC 1755. One that has automated RCOI process based on a set of suppliers that meets criteria that you set so you can track and request responses. Because it supports standard reporting, the responses will automatically upload from the supplier into the database, and the analytical engine will determine, the state and whether it's conflict-free, whether it's not conflict-free, whatever red flags there are, etc. It will display information through dashboard views that can be shared and can be extracted for reporting. The information has to be managed historically so it's auditable and reproducible, and can ultimately be used for reporting to the SEC. So, what technologies are out there to handle this? And I think there are several, but it really depends on your perspective. So you may look at conflict minerals as a one-time event. You might just to comply with the law at minimum. So in which case you're looking for solutions that fundamentally support a single regulation, conflict minerals as it stands today. It has minimum needed capability that will allow you to take quick action in meeting the reporting deadline, and you can essentially live with a purely out-of-the-box approach. And there are solutions that do this, and they're available at a pretty reasonable cost. But what happens when the next regulation comes along, or the reporting requirements under the current conflict mineral law changes, or some important new customer imposes a requirement forcing you to collect more information? What often happens is that companies get into this panic mode. They go back to their specialists to collect the data to satisfy the requirement, and this happens again and again, and it gets expensive because nothing is reused. Well, if you take a strategic approach, you won't have that same problem because it's a systematic process. It's done as part of your everyday business practices. Data is managed. It's reusable. The solutions tend to be configurable. They're built on requirements that you've developed within your company. Usually, solutions that are part of a strategic approach scale to accommodate new regulations, changes to existing regulations, and new customer-specific requirements. Also, you want to be able to integrate with internal information systems so that you can leverage that compliance information and compliance results to drive decisions about engineering design, supplier changes, material changes, and other changes that have to be made throughout the product lifecycle. So I want to talk about several IPoint customers whose names you will recognize, and I want to share their approach and experience out of which you can derive some best practices. The first one is Caterpillar. So CAT is a $66 billion company with worldwide facilities, and what they did is they narrowed down a very, very large supply base to around 19,000 suppliers with potential for 3TG. Essentially, they followed the OECD guidelines. They divided their process into the steps that you see outlined here. So they determined products with 3TG. The first thing they did was assemble a team with clearly defined roles, the people from the materials organization, procurement, and IT who knew what was in the products, knew where the materials were, and could reach out and contact the supply chain. IT helped by integrating multiple disparate ERP databases into one central source of potential conflict mineral and supplier information that could be accessed and used to send out the survey. They then conducted the RCOI, or the Reasonable Country of Origin Inquiry, leveraging IPoint solution, web-based, rapidly deployed, that supports the EICC GESI standard. They were able to centrally manage data for easy roll-up, progress tracking, auditability, and reporting. They also took advantage of the flexibility of our solution to integrate with their in-house conflict minerals supplier database that they developed earlier on. They were also able to conduct their due diligence by making use of the shared public database platform while keeping confidential information private and secure within their own server or private cloud. They're also able to report very easily using CAT-specific reporting templates that were used for very efficient determination of product status. So a few unique things about CAT. First is, again, they took a strategic approach, and they built a foundation for longer-term compliance management by creating the Center of Excellence. Secondly, they were able to create reports and get conclusions faster than expected because they were using the data that was available in the simple dashboards to get very quickly a view of the risk that they had in the supply chain and that they could take action with. And then also, they didn't keep their information to themselves on how they were doing this. Rather, they went out to the industry groups and to the consultants to share the information and also get best practices. So organizations like AEM, NAM, AIAG, they worked with Ernst & Young as well, to share best practices, facilitate a standard process approach across the industry, and also provide feedback to regulators. And they also are active participants on IPoint's governance committee, which meets very frequently to assure that we are reflecting the needs of the industry, of our customers, and of the larger market into our product development so that we can meet their needs going forward. So Johnson Controls is a company that's similar in size to Caterpillar. They're about $43 billion in revenue. They've got worldwide operations just like Cat. And I reviewed their presentation, and from that took a couple of important points. First, Johnson Controls took a very strategic approach with conflict minerals. They went through a business argument very early on and realized that it made a lot more sense to go beyond simply obeying the law. So they took a more strategic route and decided that they would transform their supply chain into a conflict-free supply chain. And like Caterpillar, they went through the OECD process to do this work. But they set goals for themselves. How do we actually achieve a conflict-free supply chain? And they did this by setting some targets. They wanted a uniform global strategy, a common fixed framework and methodologies that was governed by standard operating procedures. They needed a centralized team consisting of all the people that would somehow touch conflict minerals internally and externally. So procurement, the sustainability organization, legal, controller, the IT team, engineering, supply chain management, audit, and public relations. They want to achieve increased transparency across their company and across their supply chain, and also keep costs under control by looking at lower cost solutions and more efficient solutions. And this is the approach they took. Again, it was very much like the OECD framework, defining the policy, getting the appropriate sponsorship at the executive level, defining organizational structure and process flow, and implementing some awareness training internally and externally for their suppliers so they knew what was coming. In the second phase, they executed, formed the team, implemented the IPoint solution, and then started to identify the suppliers that they needed to survey based on their the potential for providing 3TG, weighing out the customer expectations, the size of the business with particular customers, the likelihood of the supplier responding, things like that, and the role of the business unit, whether it was a manufacturer versus a contract for manufacturer versus a joint venture and things like that. So went through a very logical process to try to narrow down the field of suppliers they needed to survey and get data from. And then finally, in the transition phase, executing that RCOI process, they've come up with steps to validate the supplier responses through our technology, and also assessing the risk and coming up with an escalation plan if needed, whether it's a product modification or a change in supplier qualification status or some other kind of change. And ultimately, they're able to assess the conflict mineral status as part of their overall sustainability efforts. So, while many global companies are already impacted by DoddFrank 1502, this formal legislation is also very likely to be enacted in other parts of the world, including EU and Canada, and quite possibly elsewhere. And even looking at DoddFrank 1502, there are significant changes that are going to be happening, especially starting with the 2015 reporting year. So things like defining and describing product categories, describing the processing facility or smelter, putting together action plans for suppliers that are potentially using non-conflict-free smelters and things like that. Also, there's a potential scope expansion that could happen within DoddFrank 1502. Think, for example, neodymium and lithium minerals like that. Those could also be added to the scope. The EU legislation right now very similar to DoddFrank 1502 in terms of the minerals that are covered, but the scope will be increased. And then there's also in Canada Bill 486, which is also similar to Dodd-Frank, except that it also covers a wider geographic scope. So these things are going to continue to expand and change. So let's take it to the next level. So when you think of corporate social responsibility legislation, things like conflict minerals, you also think about regulatory requirements such as ROS, REACH, ELV, maybe California Prop 65, carbon reduction efforts, other types of metrics which help protect us and preserve our limited resources. And all of these things reside under the umbrella of sustainability. MIT Sloan Management Group, in conjunction with the Boston Consulting Group, conducted a survey published in 2012 that included companies that were located in the U.S., also in Europe and Australia, and indicated that sustainability is getting a whole lot of attention among higher-level management at many large corporations. So in addition to being driven by regulation and the laws and regulations we talked about earlier, there are other drivers that are influencing, such as the company's voluntary efforts to reduce carbon footprint, consumer preferences for sustainable products, and all this is leading to the interests of investors who are playing a big role in pushing the sustainability agenda. And at least a third of the executives interviewed stated that taking action towards sustainability is actually profitable as well. So it's a good thing. But while companies want to participate, they want to get on board, they want to get results, they need far more data from their supply chains to do that. So what are the challenges? It's like taking the challenges of conflict minerals and multiplying it exponentially. So to assess sustainability, again, it requires a very broad set of data. And here are a few examples, again, that I had talked about. Corporate social responsibility, banned and restricted materials, ROS, REACH, things like that, greenhouse gases, emissions, other types of laws and legislation that are coming up, such as California's Safer Consumer Product Regulation. The big challenges that come up when you start looking at large-scale data sharing are, it's hard to get the data, one, it's hard to manage it, but two, confidentiality issues, numerous inconsistent data formats, nothing is uniform. There are many internal and external databases that exist where all this information is housed that are disconnected, they don't talk to each other. There are many different solution architectures, and of course data validation issues. How do you know that the information you're getting is even real or accurate? And this is really where Sustain Hub comes in. So Sustain Hub is a collaboration that's funded by what's known as the 7th Framework Program of the European Commission. So Sustain Hub Consortium consists of 15 partners from 7 countries, and participants include electronic and automotive OEMs and suppliers, consultants, software industry participants, that's IPoint, as well as universities and other research institutes. The purpose of Sustain Hub is really to develop common processes and tools to help supply chain participants acquire the data they need a lot more efficiently in order to build greener products and also to comply with increasing numbers of regulation and increasing data demands. Sustain Hub leverages that same platform architecture on which the IPoint solution is built that customers are using today, but it's at a much, much larger scale. So we're making information available through this hub so that companies can get informed about the latest requirements. Goal, of course, is a single source of sustainability data. Through Sustain Hub, you're able to access information either through a web application or through your own in-house servers behind the firewall. Sustain Hub provides transparent access to sustainability data from lots of different heterogeneous sources. Data requests are initiated, they're tracked, they're managed through an automated data collection process, much like what we have with our platform today. And the data broker will memorize and maintain these known links into different data sources. And what that means is that sensitive product information will stay within control of the data owner, but that they'll be able to release exactly what they want to release and nothing more. And of course, what we're striving to achieve here is that this system will work independently of format or data type. So some of the advantages, again, I mentioned earlier that facilitating the information acquisition by developing automated scouting processes for sustainability requirements. And what that does is it helps any participating company on Sustain Hub keep apprised of what's happening in terms of regulation, new regulations on the horizon, and information about the regulations that are impacting them today. Lowering costs for material testing. Sustain Hub is helping to make test information available, as well as reduce the risk of non-compliance, and in doing so, reduce the the cost of testing by focusing on testing that needs to be done and eliminating redundancy wherever possible. Analyzing data to assess products while accommodating missing data. Why is this important? It's because there are situations where the data doesn't exist. You may not have a complete data set. There may be confidentiality agreements preventing the sharing of information, or the supplier may be unwilling to provide it. But it's the reality, and you still may need to assess the sustainability of your product based on the data that you have available to you right now. And we're going to make that happen through Sustain Hub. So to summarize and to wrap up, I think that we all realize that companies are being hit by more regulation and laws, not less. Conflict minerals, clearly it's an important piece of the legislation that's only going to expand. And in order to comply, companies are going to have to work together to build transparency into their supply chain. If you haven't started your effort on conflict minerals, there's time. You have 100 days before the reporting is required. You should prepare to meet that May 31st reporting deadline by taking action right away. And a tactical approach is probably the best way to attack it in the near term. But at the same time, you should also be proactive in taking steps toward a longer-term strategic approach. Again, conflict minerals isn't a one-time event. It's going to grow. It's going to expand. There are more regulations you're going to need to be concerned about. So a systematic process and a scalable solution is needed, and it makes a lot of sense to prepare for this. Also, technology is evolving to be able to accommodate these growing data requirements that are going to happen. Good news is that there's a lot of great examples of customers who've leveraged the OECD guidelines, who've been very successful with this. They've used some easy-to-use technologies to execute their strategies and also build internal processes that work. So that's really what I have today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Again, that was Dan Hertzberg, Technical Sales Manager, North America for IPoint. And if you would like a copy of the slides just presented, you can download them from the drop-down menu on the bottom left-hand side of your screen. Now let's move to the Q&A portion of our session. I'm going to present some questions to Dan in no particular order. Are you ready, Dan?
Sure.
Okay. I'm going to pair up two questions we have here because they're both product-related questions. One is SustainHub available as a commercial product? And then also we had a question, if you've been using email as a way to communicate with suppliers and that's worked okay, what are the advantages of that portal?
Okay, well, let me start it this way. So as far as SustainHub being available as a commercial product, it actually isn't at this time. But interestingly, it's a lot closer than you think because we're building SustainHub, as I mentioned, on the same technology platform available to our customers now. We're extending that same architecture to do a whole lot more in terms of broadening the scope while we're assuring the security of the data, and at the same time we're streamlining that whole end-to-end data collection process. It's really very exciting, actually, and I think revolutionary. At the same time, it's also conceptual at this point. But if you're interested in learning more, let me know. Send me an email, and I'm happy to help you on that. Now, as far as using email as a way to communicate, like you said, it works. It works okay. But portals definitely do have an advantage. Email, it's reliable. But one thing I've seen with the portal is that it allows the supplier to key in information online. It's in an electronic form that has some abilities to assure that the data that they're inputting actually makes sense. It also assures that the format that the system requires, whether it's IPoint system or some other system, can upload successfully and track the entire process end to end. Overall, it makes it easier, which I think makes portals worthwhile and definitely something you need to look at.
Great. Here's a scenario that's presented in another question we have here. You have lots of suppliers, so far haven't needed a software tool other than Excel, or at least that's your opinion. Is there a best practices approach that would help them validate that the information provided is correct and up to date?
Well, there's really no concrete way of knowing whether data is correct or not, but you do have some tools at your fingertips to address one common source of error, which is that smelters declared by the supplier may be incorrect. In fact, they're often incorrect. And you can manually cross-reference the suppliers declared by your suppliers to the EICC smelter list, the certified smelter list, also the conflict-free smelters, to see if they're valid and if they're in fact conflict-free and if they exist. It's manual. You don't need a tool to do that. It's certainly a lot of work, but the good news is that there are software tools that can pick these things up. Since these smelter lists are supported and integrated, certainly from the standpoint of our tool, these solutions allow you to manage the entire request response process, track the dates. You can automatically inform suppliers when they need to update their information and renew their information. So automation is really key to making this easier and, in fact, making it a lot more accurate.
Great. Here's another scenario presented. I have only one conflict mineral in my product, tin, and the amount is small, and most of that comes from scrap. Do I still need to report? I think a lot of folks are asking similar questions based on quantity of the materials being used.
Okay, well, I can't say for sure, but what I do know by rule of thumb is that if it's not 100% recycled, then there's a percentage of tin that's from a known source. And since there's no de minimis or minimum value, to be conservative, you would need to report. But again, going back to the software tools that are out there, these can be of benefit in terms of capturing and managing that document trail. So, for example, if your customer gets audited, he's going to ask you for proof of your sources at the time you fabricated or sold that product to him. Whether it's recycled or not recycled, that's data that you should manage and track and have available for him.
Great. This is another question you may be able to address through the product end of things. Will your tool support the next version of the EICC template that's coming out in March? And what are the differences, and how soon after release will you support it in your product?
Yeah, we will absolutely support that in our product. We support EICC Jesse and all the releases of that template. So we're definitely going to support the March release. As for the differences, there are some changes to the questions that are in that template, as well as to the smelter list, which is getting updated. And this version of the EICC template is also going to be compliant with the IPC 1755, which is also planned to be released sometime this year, and it's absolutely going to be supported with our tool as well. So we're working very closely with the ICC Jesse team to keep any time gap between the release of that template in March and our product support of that template very, very small. We want to minimize that. The intention is that this next release of the template is only going to apply to 2014 reporting, which is consistent with the plans we have as well.
Great. If I may, Dan, I'm going to ask a couple of questions of my own here. You mentioned at one point in the presentation some of the new regulations coming up globally in the EU, other jurisdictions. How does that affect efforts from a technology standpoint from companies that maybe do business in multiple jurisdictions?
Well, they're going to have to collect more information. Certainly, if the global scope increases, the geographic scope increases, they're going to have to start looking at potential business that's being done in those countries and consequently start collecting data from those countries, whereas right now under the current law, it's pretty much restricted to the DRC and the surrounding region. Now it's going to increase and get that much more difficult. Also, as the minerals that need to be accounted for grow, there's also going to be more data requirements. So it's, I think technology will be able to handle that well, and companies that prepare strategically for the expansion and changes in this kind of regulation will also be prepared to handle that without having to change their process or spend that much more money.
And a lot of companies have been putting off a lot of their preparations here, just procrastination, I guess. How late in the game is it for them to get up to speed, meet the domestic SEC requirements? And if they are behind, how quickly can they ramp up, and what should they do at this point?
Well, it's going to be pretty tough to do, especially for companies with a significant supplier base, meaning they've got more than 50, 60 suppliers. They're going to have a hard time meeting the reporting deadlines. The fact that they can report inconclusive really isn't going to help them that much, because they need to also inform about the direction they're taking as far as taking steps toward a conflict-free supply chain. I meant indeterminate, rather. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and if they're going to try to meet that reporting period, there's going to be a lot of work, and they should get started yesterday.
And also, do you expect that in the U.S. we might see some expanded obligations like we're seeing in other countries there? And should they worry about adaptability as they look to solutions?
Oh, well, we'll definitely see growth of the regulation and expansion of the regulation in the U.S. Maybe not as far as the geographies, but definitely in terms of the minerals. As I'd mentioned earlier, neodymium and also lithium in Afghanistan. So there are other countries where there are human rights abuses and reasons that we want to make sure we're careful how we do business with them. So there's definitely going to be expansion in those regulations.
Another question, Dan, is the question of supply chains and distributors. You're trying to collect all this data. You may have a distributor who just isn't really revealing where they get the materials from. They may have a supplier they just don't want to disclose. How difficult does it make, given that you kind of have to get to the bottom of what these folks use and where they get it from?
Yeah, good question. Since you absolutely have to have the data, you really need the distributors to cooperate with you. And chances are they've had this request from other customers, so maybe over time they're going to be a lot more ready to provide that information. Or depending on the size of your company and the relationship you have with a distributor, you may want to make that part of their purchase contract that, if you're buying from them, if you're giving them a purchase order, they need to provide this kind of information to you. And if it doesn't happen today with conflict minerals, it will happen in the future. And it's just because that's the way companies are going to be doing business, and so distributors are going to have to line up behind that. The downside is you may have to find another distributor or a supplier. So even if it's a problem today, I think it's just going to get better over time because they need to do that to stay in business.
Now, here's the other question, though, is given that this is an international landscape here with these minerals, is it possible to really keep controls over those contracts and those suppliers and distributors without boots on the ground? Can this data be collected remotely in that case?
It's possible, and I think that tools like SustainHub may actually help that, only because you're dealing with a global supply chain and more information is just going to become available directly without necessarily having to go through a lot of third parties. The way SustainHub is envisioned is people will simply make requests, and participating suppliers on SustainHub will respond to that request. So it's conceived in the future that this is going to be electronic and a lot more readily available, and there are going to be tools and technologies out there to help facilitate gathering that kind of information. So things are going to change, and I think it's going to be much better for OEMs and companies and anyone who has to request information up the supply chain.
And getting back to the conflict minerals themselves, are there certain minerals on this list that the SEC is requiring disclosure on that are both more widely used or potentially more problematic? For instance, we had a question about tin, which may be used in very limited quantities by some folks. Are some of these minerals more problematic than others?
Yeah, I think some of them are, really depending on the geopolitical and social situations which change. So certainly our attention will get focused on countries that don't necessarily respect human rights. In countries where business may not be done ethically, those are going to start getting bigger focus. So it's not necessarily. I mean, there are minerals that are problematic. There are concerns about rare earth minerals because of where they're mined and where they come from, and the fact that we're dependent on them. But I wouldn't say that right now there's one thing that really sticks out. It's just going to be a matter of. In fact, I think eventually it's going to cover all countries worldwide because we want to make sure we're doing business ethically, paying attention to human rights and other social issues wherever we're doing business in the world. But I can't right now think of one that is particularly problematic. Plus, not only do you have the locations where the mines actually exist, but you also have smelters all over the world as well. So it's this is a problem of not just one particular mineral or country, but of an entire supply chain.
Are there industries that you think have more to worry about than others by nature of the amount of these minerals they may or may not use? And you mentioned some case studies of what specific companies have done. Are there initiatives that you've seen in other companies or industries that just really strike you as forward-thinking and that we should emulate?
Certainly the electronics industry is taking a leadership role here. EICC, it's really dominated by the electronics industry, I believe. So they're the ones that really, when you look at conflict minerals and you look at 3TG, I think electronics industry really has the most at stake here. So they're really leading the charge in terms of, one, certifying smelters, making sure they're conflict-free, but also in driving reporting standards, data standards, and There probably, I think as more people learn about Sustain Hub and as that gets a bit more mature, I think they're going to be 100% behind that concept as well. So I would say electronics, more than anyone else, has the most at stake and is really being very proactive in trying to make this, trying to solve this problem and make it easier for suppliers and customers.
Another question that's come to us is, how does your product protect the confidentiality of the data it collects? This is, obviously a lot of sensitive material. It affects a lot of suppliers and distributors. So what can it do to make sure that level of security is in place?
Yeah, that is data confidentiality is a very big concern. And I think from the beginning, when we were developing this product, we kept that in mind. So the way our platform works is that suppliers and others that are subscribers to the platform are visible and can be seen by any other subscriber on the platform. So you can see who's participating and who you could potentially reach out to get information. But the information itself, the conflict minerals declarations, information about the suppliers, who the contacts are, request information, and other types of data that are collected in this process are actually protected and are considered private and only available to the subscriber of that particular company. So we've really put a firm dividing line between the data that everybody can see and the data that's protected and is only visible to the persons who's requested it and who's received it. So that's worked very, very effectively. And again, we've got over 13,000 subscribers to our system, and that hasn't come up as an issue, or if it has, it's been addressed very quickly. And in fact, some new capabilities that have been introduced allow you to go a step further and take your data off the public platform, even if it's protected, and make it private by having its own server, or what we call a private cloud. So you can even take that step, and that's also available as part of our product. So it's an important issue. Glad you brought it up, and we definitely provide multiple layers of protection to assure that data is confidential and protected.
Well, thank you very much. That I hope was a very informative session for the listeners. Again, everyone, that was our guest, Dan Hertzberg, Technical Sales Manager, North America for IPoint. And a very special thanks to IPoint for making this webcast possible. This webcast has been recorded and will be available sometime in the next day or two. CPE credit is now available for archived webcasts. Please check out our on-demand CPE library under the Webcasts tab at www.complianceweek.com. Once again, to obtain your CPE credit after the presentation, wait until I finish this wrap-up. At that point, the webcast will close automatically, and the final examination will be presented in a separate window. If you have trouble viewing the CPE test or receiving the CPE certificate, please just send an email to info@complianceweek.com to request a copy. This concludes this session of our webcast forum on conflict minerals. Our next session will be at 3 p.m. Eastern, and we'll discuss the challenges and strategies of conflict minerals compliance. Thank you again for joining us today, and goodbye.